Who are this new elite that are influencing our way of life and the national conversation? Because they're not elected, are they?
Not always. What I'm doing in this book, Mark, is pointing to the rise of a new middle-class graduate elite, people who tend to come from affluent families whose parents often belong to the managerial professional class, who tend to live in the big cities, the university towns, and crucially, unlike the old elite, Mark, they tend to lean very strongly to the left on cultural issues like immigration, sex, gender, diversity, and so on. And within that group, Mark, I point specifically to a sort of smaller group called the radical progressives, who represent about 15% of Britain. They're disproportionately dominant in the institutions, the creative industries, advertising, marketing, to some extent politics, and they're really out of touch with the rest of the country on a whole host of issues like how we think about our history, our identity. And that group has been most strong and loud in its opposition to the book, I think, because they really don't like the mirror being held up to them. So it's been an interesting few weeks, which of course began in a conversation on this show, I remember, a few weeks ago.
Indeed so. I've got to admit, I'm watched with great amusement as well-paid, influential radio presenters and journalists, the likes of James O'Brien on LBC, Alistair Campbell, furiously criticising your book, attacking you in quite a personal way. The elite didn't like your book about the elite.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think because members of the new elite like to think of themselves as the oppressed underdogs, the people who are fighting the system, they're fighting the old elite, and they don't like to think that they have an enormous amount of political and cultural power themselves. Alistair Campbell's a great example of this, somebody who does wield considerable influence over the national conversation, but who would instantly deny that he's having any influence at all, because in his eyes, it's all about opposing Brexit, opposing the Tories. And what I'm saying here, Mark, is that actually, if we think about who has access to not just political power, but cultural power, social power, who defines the issues that we're allowed to talk about, who talks about the rest of society. My argument here is that I think millions of people, including those watching this show, feel that they're not in the national conversation. And if they are, they're certainly not respected. Maybe Brexit voters feel that they were ridiculed for years. Maybe conservatives feel like their concerns over immigration and the borders aren't taken as seriously as the concerns that liberals have over issues like opposing Rwanda, for example. And I think these value divides have become enormous today. And really, that's why I wrote the book, because I think many people sense that actually their view of the world is not being sufficiently represented.
And I know you've had lots of people writing to you in hushed tones saying, I work for a corporation, I work for a local authority, and we agree with everything that you've written, but we just can't say it publicly. Do you think this powerful new elite will hang on to their influence for the foreseeable future?
Well, it's interesting, Mark. Some of the people who have written to me confidentially, we're not talking even about, ordinary folks on the street even. I'm talking about top-level senior servants, directors of major FTSE 100 companies, human resources directors, people who have all said, look, you're onto something here. The orthodoxy has become stifling. I can't say what I want to say. I'm being forced to embrace a set of values that I don't share. 60% of the country, Mark, now feel they can't say what they really want to say in wider society. So this is a really big issue. I think the new elite are being forced, as we saw with Brexit, as we saw with the 2019 election, they're being forced to really give up and give away some of their power, and they're not reacting well to that. They've doubled down on their own group. I think partly that's why we have GB News. That's why we have this new media ecosystem, is because this group has done a very bad job actually of opening up the national conversation. So I think, there are more people out there who want to look at alternative conversations, alternative media. And I think if you look globally, Mark, look, these rebellions have gone nowhere. Look at France, look at Italy, look at Sweden, look at the US next year with the presidential election. I've been saying now for 10 years, people are completely disconnected from the mainstream parties and they're looking for something different. And the new elite have been very hostile in their response to that. Their standard operation, Mark, is to denounce and stigmatize anybody who challenges them as being a sort of, a crank, a contrarian, someone who is not somehow socially acceptable. But we're talking about millions of people, right? As you know, millions of people who say, I don't share this consensus.